Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for what I like to call the life cycle of a defender. Today we're delivering a masterclass straight from Chapter 2 of the official CISSP study guide. We are going to move seamlessly from the intricacies of managing human beings who, let's face it, are your organization's most unpredictable assets, all the way to quantifying security risks with hard, indisputable math. So if you're a CISSP candidate, or honestly just a practitioner aiming to elevate your security governance game, this is exactly where you need to be. Let's dive right in.
Our agenda today covers a 5-module deep dive. We'll be looking at personnel security, internal controls, risk analysis, risk frameworks, and finally, social engineering. This structured journey maps perfectly to the ISC2 objectives to make sure you're ready for the exam.
Module 1. Personnel Security, the Human Element. Because as we know, defense actually starts long before an employee even touches a keyboard.
The employee life cycle requires really strict governance at every single phase. Step 1 is screening and hiring. Things like background checks, reference checks, and education verification initiate the process to prove a candidate is trustworthy. Then we hit onboarding, where mandatory agreements like non-disclosure agreements and acceptable use policies are signed. But I really want you to pay special attention to Step 3, transfers. When an employee moves to a new department, you cannot just stack their new privileges on top of their old ones. We absolutely have to enforce the principle of least privilege here, granting only the minimum access necessary. In fact, in some cases, a transfer is treated exactly like a termination and a rehire, just to ensure a completely clean auditing slate.
And eventually we reach offboarding. Now, whether it's a friendly resignation or a completely hostile termination, the mechanical steps must remain identical to minimize organizational risk. Firing someone is a really complex process, and timing is everything. You must disable their network access immediately, ideally at the exact same time they're being notified or even just prior. The termination meeting has to include a witness, like a manager or security guard, followed by an exit interview. You collect all those security tokens and badges, and finally they are escorted off the premises. Having a prompt, highly scripted process protects both the organization and the remaining employees.
Module 2. Internal Controls, Preventing Collusion. So, now that we've covered the life cycle itself, let's shift focus to how we manage internal processes once those employees are actively working inside the network.
2 absolutely critical concepts for preventing fraud are separation of duties and split knowledge. Separation of duties means splitting critical functions among multiple users. For example, the person who approves an invoice shouldn't be the same person who physically writes the check, right? Split knowledge takes this a step further. 2 users must literally combine their privileges to perform one single action. Think of it like 2 halves of an emergency administrator password. By requiring 2 or more people to work together to complete a task, you ensure that a single person just cannot compromise the system on their own. To commit fraud, they'd have to conspire with someone else, a concept known as collusion. These checks and balances drastically increase the risk of detection for any insider threat.
And speaking of detecting fraud, let's look at a highly testable, incredibly powerful detective control: mandatory vacations. In industries like finance, an employee is required to take 1 to 2 weeks off, and their remote access is completely revoked. You might be wondering, why? Well, because it forces another employee to take over their role and log into the system to perform their duties. This peer review process exposes any hidden fraud, abuse, or negligence. It is extremely difficult for a bad actor to hide their tracks from the person sitting in their chair doing their exact job.
Module 3. Risk Analysis, Quantifying the Threat. Now we are getting into the mathematical, scenario-based heart of this explainer. So, how do you actually put a price tag on a potential disaster? I really want you to think about this, because risk assessment is not just an IT security hurdle, it is a fundamental business problem. Management needs real details to make decisions about which risks to mitigate, which to transfer, and which to just accept. To answer that question, we use 2 approaches: qualitative and quantitative analysis. And prudent due care actually requires using both for a balanced perspective. Qualitative analysis relies on scenarios, judgment, and intuition. It ranks threats on a scale, say from low to high. A great example of a qualitative tool is the Delphi technique, which is an anonymous feedback process used by a group to reach an uninfluenced consensus. Quantitative analysis, on the other hand, is entirely objective. It uses hard financial values, math functions, and percentages. It removes opinion entirely and gives you concrete dollar figures.
Now, what's really interesting about this flow is how logical the progression is. You start way at the top by assigning an asset value. Then you calculate the exposure factor,
calculate the single loss expectancy, assess the annualized rate of occurrence, derive the annualized loss expectancy, and finally, at the very bottom, you perform a cost-benefit analysis of your countermeasures. It's a brilliant step-by-step logic that takes you from a single server's price tag all the way to a major budget decision.
Let's break down the math you absolutely need to know for the exam. SLE stands for Single Loss Expectancy. This is the financial loss from one single realized threat against a specific asset. The formula is asset value multiplied by the exposure factor. The exposure factor is simply the percentage of loss an organization would experience if a specific asset were violated. So, for example, if a building is worth $100,000 and a fire would destroy 25% of it, your single loss expectancy is $25,000. Easy, right?
Next, we scale that single event into a yearly budget figure called the Annualized Loss Expectation, or ALE. You take that SLE we just calculated and multiply it by the annualized rate of occurrence, which is basically how many times you expect this threat to happen in a single year. Once you have the ALE, you can do a cost-benefit calculation to see if a safeguard is actually worth buying. The formula is simple. Take the ALE before the safeguard, subtract the ALE after the safeguard, and then subtract the annual cost of the safeguard. If that resulting number is positive, well, the safeguard actually improves security without breaking the bank.
Module 4. Risk, Frameworks, and Responses. Now we transition from calculating the risk to actually handling it.
So the crucial point here is that management has 6 choices based on their organization's risk appetite. They can mitigate risk by implementing countermeasures. They can assign or transfer it, like by purchasing insurance. They can use deterrence to scare off violators. They can choose avoidance by selecting a completely different, safer activity altogether. They can accept the risk, meaning the cost of the countermeasure outweighs the potential loss, or they can reject it, which, for the record, is considered an entirely unacceptable response in our industry.
To manage these responses systematically, federal agencies and a lot of private organizations use the NIST Risk Management Framework, defined in Special Publication 837. It's a cyclical process. Step 1 is prepare. This is the process initiation phase where you establish the context and priorities for managing security and privacy risk at the organizational level.
Let's move on and see how this builds directly into Step 2, categorize. Once prepared, you categorize the system and the information it processes, stores, and transmits. This categorization is strictly based on a thermoanalysis of the impact of loss.
Then we move to Step 3, select. Here, you select an initial set of security controls for the system and tailor them as needed to reduce risk to an acceptable level. From there, the cycle continues organically through implementing those controls, assessing them, authorizing the system, and continuously monitoring.
Now, regardless of the framework you're using, you must master the difference between total risk and residual risk. Total risk is what you face if 0 safeguards are implemented. It's the native, inherent risk. Residual risk is what remains after you've implemented your security controls. It's the risk management simply chooses to accept. The exact terminology you need to lock into your memory here is the controls gap. Residual risk is equal to total risk minus the controls gap.
Module 5. Social Engineering and Awareness. We've talked about policies, math, and frameworks, but now we absolutely have to address the ultimate vulnerability, the human firewall.
Social engineering exploits human nature and behavior to bypass all the technical controls we just mathematically calculated. Attackers leverage natural traits like respect for authority, urgency, and trust. And the vectors are vast. We're talking phishing via email, whaling, which targets high-level executives, tailgating or piggybacking into a physical building, vishing over the telephone, and pretexting, where an attacker creates a totally fabricated scenario to elicit information. To counter all of this, organizations must constantly evaluate the effectiveness of their awareness programs.
But there is a vital distinction you must make for the exam between security awareness and security training. Awareness is simply establishing security as a recognized entity for users, making them realize that security matters in their day-to-day. Training comes after. Training is teaching employees the specific skills they need to perform their exact work tasks while complying with the security policy. Simply put, awareness gets their attention, training gives them the tools. I want to leave you with a provocative question that really synthesizes everything we've explored today. How would you handle a newly discovered vulnerability in an end-of-life legacy system? Remember, legacy systems are a massive threat because they no longer receive vendor updates. Would you just accept the risk? Would you mitigate it with a compensating control? What does your cost-benefit analysis tell you? Security is never a one-time setup. It's a continuous, dynamic process of evaluation.
Keep questioning, keep calculating, and keep defending. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.